Last lecture will bring together, I hope, certain themes from the week. It asks a question that I asked at one level on Sunday night at a community talk, but I'm going to answer it in a rather different way tonight. How did Jews in the diaspora become Israelis? During the first half of the 20th century, Zionist activists called for a rigorous and tutelary process of Hebraicization, or what was called in Hebrew, hitartzut, territorialization, of diaspora Jewish immigrants to Palestine. Most scholarship on the subject accepts that this top-down project was successful and then looks to Zionist elites and agents. But I wonder how much of this process, by which diaspora Jews became natives in a new land, was in fact organic, unscripted. What was the relationship between the organic and mechanical sources of national consciousness? How similar was the formation of a new collective identity among Jews in Palestine, then Israel, to processes of creolization of European colonists in various lands in modern times? Now, I'm aware of the sensitivity of the term colonial, which I'll be using a lot today, and I want to explain why and how I use it. The term has been used in a pejorative sense to describe Zionism ever since the 1920s. The term gained a more precise definition in Maxine Rodenson's long essay of 1967, which was called Israel, a Settler Colonial State. Countless writers have followed in Rodenson's wake, comparing the methods, the goals, and the underlying ideologies of Zionist settlement with those of European colonization in North America, South Africa, Australasia, and Algeria. In recent years, this theme has been taken up insightfully by a number of scholars, some of whom will be known to those of you in the room this afternoon who are students of Israeli history and society: the late Baruch Kimmerling, Ian Lustig, Gershon Shafir, and Gabi Peterberg. The emphasis in this literature tends to be on the affects and technologies of the settlement process in general and the expropriation of the Palestinians in particular. The specific issue of Zionist nativization is not treated very often because it doesn't really sit well with these projects' general thrust, which is to argue for Zionism's foreignness, aggressiveness, and tragic consequences. In other words, it's much less interested in looking at the sensibilities of the actors, of the Jews who become Israelis. It tends to focus on outcomes and outcomes that they find to be regrettable. In most respects, the Zionist project was embedded in the era of colonialism, and it bore that era's common features: the dual sense of compassion and condensation towards the natives, the notion of a mission civilisatrice, but also a compulsion to separate from the natives, faith in Western technology to revive a once fertile but now desertified land, the notion of making the desert bloom, which is not unique to the Zionists. In fact, French and Algeria used exactly the same language in the 1870s and the 1880s. The marshalling of international investment capital for plantation societies and other potentially profitable projects. After all, the third president of the World Zionist Organization was a German colonial official who had worked extensively in German colonial projects in Africa. Even the Zionists' most hallowed moral scruple, that the land should be worked by Jews rather than hired Arab labor, was analogous to North American pioneer settlers' belief in the divine commandment to work the land by the sweat of one's brow. It stands to reason that comparative study can throw light on the process by which Jewish immigrants to Palestine creolized and indigenized when colonists, or more often their children, became native sons. These insights in turn can throw new light on the general relationship between Zionism and settlement colonialism. Now, comparative history, as I'm going to attempt this evening, is a field unto itself. It's best understood as a fruitful form of counterfactual history, which I'm actually going to get to towards the end of my remarks today. In order to understand how things are, we have to be able to understand the specific circumstances under which things might have been different. Scientists determine causation in laboratory settings by finding that multiple similar outcomes share only one common antecedent, or that multiple different outcomes differ in only one antecedent. But we don't have laboratories in history. We can't run history over again, change a factor and see what happens. That would be, I wonder if I can get a grant for that. It would have to be a really big grant. We don't have laboratories. The only laboratory we have is our mind. And so, lacking a laboratory, historians must resort to comparative history. While those comparisons are too messy to allow for just one difference, under some circumstances they can form a base for causal claims. If we see similar outcomes in different geographic or temporal settings, it's possible to try to find some underlying explanatory factor. With that goal in mind, I'm looking today at colonial New England, as well as modern South Africa and Algeria, to illustrate processes of identity and society formation that were shared with the Zionist project. I will also highlight those aspects of Zionism in Israel that lack direct comparison with any of these three comparative situations. As distinguished historians from Mark Bloch to George Fredrickson have observed, the purpose of comparative history is to gain insight from the understanding of difference as well as similarity across time and space. No reputable historian would construct a fixed model of settlement colonialism and then jam multiple historical situations into it. So let me make something clear. I take it as a given that Zionist feelings of historic and religious attachment to the land of Israel are unique in the annals of settler colonialism. The Zionist project also lacked the colony-metropole relationship, so central to other forms of settlement colonialism. And yet, the State of Israel has shared, along with many other colonial situations, the encounter between immigrants and an indigenous population in the land they wish to settle. It is fruitless to attempt to separate Zionism from settlement colonialism altogether. Indeed, it is perverse to do so, especially given the fact that some of the Zionist movement's most intelligent and perceptive leaders, including Vladimir Jabotinsky, made the connection between Zionism and colonialism explicit and presented it in a positive way. Each of the four cases I am invoking today has unique features. Each shares some elements with some or all the rest. In a classic essay from 20 years ago, the poet and anthropologist Zali Gurevich claimed that unlike other peoples, whose nativity is natural and taken for granted, that of Israel's Jews is mediated, reflective, and overwrought, defined by doubt and insecurity. Yes, national identities are always constructed, never natural, but Gurevich is, of course, right, that they are presented as sempiternal, forever and always, via the means of education, government, and the mass media. Now, the anxiety that Gurevich locates at the center of the Israeli soul, I'm going to argue today, has troubled other settlement colonials. Particularly in their society's early years, worry lest they meld into the aboriginals leads them to separate themselves, to dominate, to marginalize the natives, and to artfully extol their own indigeneity. So Israel has not been entirely alone. Although, as you'll see at the end of my remarks, I will conclude by saying that the particularly mediated form of Israeli nativity does, at the end of the day, have a number of unique features. So again, comparison highlights difference. It brings up areas of similarity. Now I'm going to start with the New World. So this is a rather different tour d'horizon from the one I offered yesterday. It's a truism of scholarship on national movements that states are made before nations. As Massimo D'Azeglio famously remarked, abbiamo fatto l'Italia, ora dobbiamo fare gli italiani. We've made Italy, now we have to make Italians. If we want to know when the English colonists in British North America became American, an obvious time to look would be the Revolutionary Wars and the establishment of the sovereign federal republic. The idea of being something other than an English colonial, of being an American, actually precedes the revolution, though, by decades, perhaps by almost a century. In 17th century New England, the roots of American identity lay in a complex and troubling encounter with the environment and with native peoples. Puritan settlers feared that they would not succeed at creating a replica of England, tranquil and civilized. Is England tranquil and civilized? Good. I'm glad to hear it. They were afraid that the colonists would succumb to the savagery of New England's harsh environment. Nature was cruel and terrifying. Winters were lethally cold, the forests unimaginably vast, thick, and dark. Nature, rough and savage, was to be conquered, subdued, and exploited. Now, early Zionist settlers, in their own way, could dread the land of their ancestral yearnings, invoking the biblical land that devours its inhabitants. This time, that's a biblical phrase, this time through disease, heat, and arid, unforgiving soil. Now, compared with New England, Palestine's smaller size and relative population density, capacity for rapid environmental improvement, thanks to the beneficent force of Second Industrial Revolution technology, and most of all, its status in the Zionist imagination as the Jews' ancient patrimony softened and countered the environmental threat in Palestine. Nature was as much the Jews' lover as it was their nemesis. For the Puritans, as for the Zionists, native peoples were both human and objects of nature. While some Europeans fantasized about the Indian as noble savage, Puritans were more likely to see the red man as sempiternally cursed, a latter-day Canaanite, even the seed of Amalek, whose destruction was to be celebrated rather than mourned. As John Winthrop remarked on what he believed to be the miracle of mass deaths of natives through disease, quote, "If God were not pleased with our inheriting these parts, why did he drive out the natives before us?" And there might be an interesting parallel there with the case of Israel, where the mass flight of Palestinians in 1948 was seen as equally miraculous, unexpected, yet welcome, so much so that the refugees were not allowed to return, even though the vast majority of them had not taken up arms against Israel. Puritans also conceived of natives as meliorable through Christianization, although this process carried considerable risk, as it demanded living among them, possibly falling into their coarse and savage ways, and succumbing to the sexual allure of their womenfolk. Unlike South America, where European men came alone as conquerors and laborers, and frequently cohabited with the native women, in Protestant colonial North America, immigrants came as families to set up model religious communities. The famous case of John Smith and Pocahontas notwithstanding, in general, a society that aspires to be a New Jerusalem discourages open mixing with what were seen as latter-day Canaanites. On the western frontier in the 19th century, Native Americans were more likely to be objects of male sexual desire, precisely because European men on the frontier were likely to be alone and like loose electrons looking to bond. While Americans' exclusionary racial identity did not by any means cut off sexual encounters between whites and natives, all the more so between whites and blacks, mestizo and mulatto service castes in colonial South America did not really find a counterpart. So there's a lot more mixing between natives and immigrants in South America than in, say, the United States. Now, for the early Zionists, in the decades before the Arab became clearly denoted as a political enemy, he could be an object of suspicion, also a carrier of the virus of indolence and Levantinity, but also an object of pity, paternalistic affection, even romanticized emulation. Recent scholarship has shown that social and economic contacts between the two communities, between Jews and Arabs, were more extensive than we'd previously believed. And during the 1920s and 30s, there were some cases of sexual and romantic contact between Jews and Arabs, mainly between Jewish women of Mizrahi origin and Arab men in Jaffa or southern Tel Aviv. These incidents aroused great anxiety amongst Jewish and Palestinian elites alike, but they were few. And unlike so many colonial situations in the 19th and 20th century world, the Arab woman was rarely an object of sexual fantasy in the literature or art of the Yishuv. And that is, by the way, quite an exception. When you think about the way the colonial man tends to view the native woman, you just don't really see that very much in Zionist culture. Now, perhaps the most interesting parallel between the colonial North American and the Zionist experiences lay in the New World Englishman's simultaneous anxiety about and celebration of a loss of refinement as a result of distance from the European homeland. In the late 17th century, the fiery preacher Cotton Mather described his son, Increase, that was his name, Increase Mather. He described him as, quote, "a tame Indian, for so the Europeans are pleased sometimes to denominate the children that are born in these regions." So he calls him a tame Indian, a native. In a sermon delivered in 1686, at the age of 26, Mather, not Increase, this is Cotton the father, fretted lest the English fall into a state of what he called Creoline degeneracy, a fate that could be avoided only by willfully, consciously performing an English identity. Mather simultaneously lamented the roughness of his and his peers' manner and celebrated the directness and simplicity of their speech and character. The American, as the colonists increasingly came to be called, was obliged to assert his Englishness through dress, furnishing, and high culture. And yet, the new American was to maintain a moral integrity of a plain-spoken provincial. You might see the parallel here to the ideal Sabra, the ideal native Israeli, who remained, particularly in the early years of the state. The ideal is to be deeply connected to European culture, while being a child of the land, who prided himself on knowledge of Arab ways while limiting contact with the Arabs. Cotton Mather spoke a 17th century Dugri, while embracing Anglophilia as a prophylactic against Creoline degeneracy. This is something I really imbibed quite at first hand in my first years living in Israel on kibbutz in the 1970s and 80s with the founders of the kibbutz, who were, of course, European-born, some of them coming to Palestine, though very young, before the state was founded, and who had memorized vast swaths of not only Hebrew literature, but Shakespeare, Goethe, Schiller. I mean, they really mastered the Western canon, and they were working in the cotton fields, right? So it's this combination of this mastery of Western culture and the plain-spoken persona that is very much a colonial frontier creation. Now, to move on to South Africa, things get, I think, a little bit more tense because of the way that comparisons between Israel and South Africa are all too often made in polemical writings. It's quite common for people to draw parallels and even equivalents between the position of Palestinians in the occupied territories and the practice of apartheid. This emphasis is on what has been called by scholars of South Africa operative apartheid, what happened on the ground, and distracts attention from apartheid's historical roots and fundamental dimensions, aspects of which do indeed throw some light on the Zionist project. Unlike North America, South Africa did not witness a decimation of the native population. Although the Aboriginal pastoralists known as the Khoikhoi were largely wiped out by smallpox and other diseases carried by white settlers, most of the Bantu-speaking farmers of southern Africa were immune to smallpox. The history of white settlement in southern Africa was always characterized by being outnumbered by the natives, and therefore there was a fear, a demographic threat, that in the early 20th century was described as a fear of swamping. That was the term that was used quite widely. The need to restrict native access to land claimed by whites to root Africans in particular places so as to separate and stabilize them led to the Native Land Act of 1913, which institutionalized many long-standing practices of segregation and can be considered a legislative precedent for apartheid. Ironically, the rhetoric of demographic threat intensified even during the period of high apartheid, with the acceleration of white out-migration in the 1970s. The terror of being swamped led to a panicky rejection of gelijkstelling, in Afrikaans, equalization or equality, between white and black. The equivalent to what in Israel-Palestine today might be called as the fear of a one-state solution, or what it might mean for Israel, the notion of being overwhelmed by a Palestinian Arab majority in time. Now, white fear in South Africa led to the construction of a number of psychological defenses. Classic Afrikaner historiography refers to southern Africa as having been thinly populated at the time of the white invasion, and of Bantus as immigrants who arrived in substantive numbers only after the whites had established themselves. The natives, then, were not really natives, but newcomers, as opposed to the old stock Afrikaners who had kind of priority. Unfortunately for white South African nationalists, the black population's allegedly tardy arrival did not prevent them from presenting a constant danger, one that was not swept away as in North America by disease or decisive warfare that reduced the native population to a few remnants bottled up on reserves. The sempiternal quality of the white-black conflict inhibited the production of favorable views of natives as noble savages. That is, in South Africa, you don't really get the noble savage motif, whereas in North America, it was propagated precisely in the later 19th and 20th centuries when the native no longer presented a threat. As George Fredrickson observes, traditional enemies who remain dangerous are not romanticized. South African white youth do not have a tradition of playing Voortrekkers and Zulus, after the manner of Euro-Americans playing cowboys and Red Indians. Now, the parallels with Palestine and Israel are obvious. The notion of demographic threat, the claims that Palestine prior to the arrival of the Zionist was a mostly empty land, a constant theme in Zionist writing is Palestine as an empty land, although even with the Negev, a desert that takes up about half of the area of Palestine, Palestine's population density was about 4 times that of North or South America. Without the Negev, it was very similar to Lebanon or Syria in the early 20th century. Israeli Jewish youth likely to enjoy a spirited game of Zion are not likely, to enjoy a spirited game of Zionists and Arabs, at least not one where the two sides fight on equal terms and with some degree of moral equivalency. Now, in South America, North America, and Palestine alike, natives sought allies among the colonists in their ongoing internecine conflicts. The colonists, in turn, were profoundly divided. Until the 1920s, when one spoke in South Africa about the racial question, it referred to Afrikaners in English, not whites and blacks. There were fissures within each community, divided by sub-ethnicity and class. The construction of a unified Afrikaner ethnic identity came late in the 1930s and 40s, and it was a product of the Great Depression and World War II, when lower-class Afrikaners who were seeking social mobility lent Afrikaner agricultural and industrial capitalists political support in return for high wages and social status. The meeting of minds between Afrikaner and English South Africans came in the wake of decades of labor strife. During the 1920s, white laborers went on strike against mine owners who preferred cheap black labor. The strikers provoked a ferociously violent response from the government, prompting the white laborers to appeal to the international socialist community with the slogan, "Workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa." Now, I'll get to the parallels for this in just a moment. The English and Afrikaner communities in South Africa do not map well, really, onto Israel because the Ashkenazic-Mizrahi split is something different. It's more akin to the historic division, say, between Francophones and Anglophones in Lower and Upper Canada. Like the Quebecois, Afrikaners were historically rural and often poor, a peasant and laboring class that resented English hegemony. In South Africa, these tensions were only resolved after 1948, with the triumph of the National Party, which implemented not only apartheid, but also the Afrikanerization of the civil service and professions. And this is what brought Afrikaners and English into a similar socioeconomic position and created a unified white community. And something similar, by the way, has happened in Canada in the last 30 years with the Silent Revolution in Quebec and essentially the rise of Quebecois autonomy and the growth of the Quebecois commercial, industrial, upper bourgeoisie. And yet, I see some parallels between the Zionist and the South African cases in a process of homogenization of sub-ethnicities, that is, a process of intellectual and political fusion by which a coherent Afrikaner identity was invented. This does bear some comparison with the creation of Israeli identity, that is, Ashkenazic and Mizrahi Israelis sort of coming together to form a common Israeli nationhood, as does the idiosyncratic blend of internationalism and ethnocentrism in the Afrikaner labor movement and in the Zionist labor movement, because after all, the Zionist labor movement of the interwar period and beyond was intent primarily in organizing the Jewish working class. That was its primary goal. Now, this question about being a colonial society, being a frontier society, helps answer all sorts of questions about a number of countries. It also might help explain something about Israel's fiercely democratic character. Now, Israel, as we know, might be an imperfect democracy, but it is a democracy, certainly for those people who live within the borders of the state as defined by pre-1967. Now, why is this? Why is the Israeli state so fiercely democratic? It might derive from the intentions of its founders, or perhaps from deep-seated Judaic values, but it might also be the fact that the world's most democratic countries tend to be settler colonial states. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. For the most part, these are supremely frontier democratic states. Frontier societies are based on an inextricable mixture of inclusion and exclusion. Inclusion of whites and exclusion of natives and slaves. They're new societies, free of the heritage of graduated privilege and social hierarchy that weighed heavily in the old world. Within the bubble of the enfranchised community, freedom of expression is protected, even cherished, and the state operates according to the rule of law. The contradictions between settler democracy and racial or ethnic oppression, though, don't continue forever. The United States never retreated from its marginalization of the natives, but divisions over slavery pushed the country into a civil war that led to the abolition of slavery, and eventually to a vibrant and increasingly inclusive democracy. In South Africa of the 1970s and 80s, violent resistance against apartheid at home and global condemnation of the regime led some of the country's most powerful leaders to admit that apartheid must be reformed or eliminated. Yet during the mid-1980s, the regime retreated from democracy as it imposed a state of emergency, and the long-reigning National Party was threatened by a new far-right conservative party. Now, Israel is far smaller and younger than either the United States or South Africa. Its conflict with the Palestinians is perhaps even more resistant to resolution than the question of balancing the human and social rights of South Africa's natives with those of whites, many of whose families had been in the land for centuries. South Africa may not provide models of conflict resolution any more than the status of West Bank Arabs is identical with apartheid. But in recent years, Israel has appeared to be experiencing a crisis of confidence, a weakening of democratic institutions, and consolidation of extremist forces that appear to parallel South Africa during apartheid's final stages. As I'll show in a few minutes, however, I think these comparisons don't work. But for the moment, I want to offer one final situation of comparison, one that's not made as often as the Israel-South Africa one. And that's between Israel and French Algeria, particularly Algeria at the fin de siècle up to the mid-20th century. Now remember, Algeria was an integral part of France, right? It wasn't considered a colony, it was an integral part of the country. In the early 1900s, French administrators interpreted Algeria through Latin classical literature on the Maghreb, literature that they read familiarly, intimately, not unlike Zionist readings of the Bible. So you'd go through Algeria with your copy of some ancient Roman historian, and you would venerate for example, the military strategy used by a particular Roman general in Algeria, just as Zionists would say, just as David or Solomon or whatever, or just as Avner, the military commander, whatever, did this and this. Military strategy, harkening back to ancient times, has some meaning for our own day. French scholars zealously pursued archaeological excavations of Roman ruins so as to cement the link between the ancient and modern Latin rulers of the land. The motley immigrants from the northern Mediterranean who became the Pieds Noirs were called the Latins of Africa, said to comprise a new race, fair of form, committed to hard labor, and to reviving the land from neglect at the hands of ostensibly indolent and fanatical Arabs and Berbers. I'm not making my own judgments here, this is the way these people thought about the situation. The archaeologist and writer Louis Bertrand saw the natives as devolved Latins, preserving only shards of the Roman heritage. In Algerian cities, street names evoked ancient Rome and modern France. Arab and Muslim names were rare. There are obvious parallels between all of these phenomena and Zionist aspirations for a global ingathering of Jewish immigrants, simultaneously inventing and restoring an ancient nation, as well as Zionist views of Palestinians as the land's long-time residents, but neither its stewards nor its owners. That whole question of how the Israelis view the Arabs, in some ways they see them as kind of descended from remnants of ancient Israelites who go back to biblical times, a kind of a Galapagos Jew, sort of unchanged through time. By the late 1800s, Mediterranean settlers in Algeria were calling themselves Algerians, or the Algerian people, and they expressed their identity in a distinct and earthy French dialect. This new collective identity, like that of the new Hebrew nation arising in Eretz Israel, was created in astonishing speed only a few decades after the onset of mass colonization. The sense of rootedness and unmediated belonging to the land characterized even the most sensitive and conciliatory member of the Pied Noir intelligentsia, Albert Camus. Camus I see as resembling in many ways dovish Israeli intellectuals of our own time, struggling with the clashing demands of two peoples for a single land. Camus once claimed, "I've had a long love affair with Algeria, which will undoubtedly never end, and which keeps me from being completely lucid. Algeria is my true country." In his writings from the 1950s, Camus remained stubbornly Eurocentric. He imagined an Algeria rooted in the mists of Greco-Roman's past, rather than 1,300 years of Muslim civilization. And yet he was a principled and uncompromising enemy of Pied Noir chauvinism. He condemned the French authorities' brutal oppression of the Algerian national movement, no less than the terrorist tactics of the FLM. In his writings, Camus systematically deconstructed the chauvinist and radical anti-colonial arguments deployed by each side against the other. He depicted an Algeria of two nations, bound not by history or shared experience, but by common love of the land, by desire, and most important of all, by suffering. Angoisse. He warned darkly, in Algeria, French and Arabs are condemned to live together or to die together. To quote from Horace, mutato nomine, fabula de te narrator. Change the name, and the story is told of you. Now, as I said at the beginning, the purpose of comparative history is to highlight distinction as well as commonality. Settler colonialism and the creolized identities of immigrants to a new land are abstract categories. They're not lived reality. And we've seen that settler colonial societies in their early years are often beset by fears of the Aboriginals. This fear leads them to separate themselves from the natives, while at the same time they extol their identity. Israeli identity is particularly fraught because even after several generations, the existence of the Jewish state appears to be in doubt. Not only present-day security, but also the Jews' long memory of the Holy Land have caused Israeli identity, as I said at the outset, to be mediated, reflective, and at times overwrought. Long before the Jews moved en masse to the land of Israel, the land was an idealized image in the Jews' imagination. For Jews abroad and for Israelis in their state, the centrality and sacrality of Israel are intensified by existential panic. Israel's supporters tend to attribute the Israeli government's ongoing expansion of West Bank settlements, which make impossible the establishment of a viable Palestinian state. They attribute this to the threat that a Palestinian state would pose to Israel's security. And regardless of whether this is true or not, Israel has been able to resist international pressure more successfully, say, than France did over Algeria, or South Africa over apartheid. And it's interesting because in South Africa, a lot of the crisis of confidence of the Afrikaner elites came with neoliberalization and the growth of the Afrikaner economy. So you had more and more Afrikaner businessmen going abroad, and they would travel abroad and they came back feeling that their country had really had to alter its fundamental structure. Now Israel, of course, has undergone massive economic transformations in the last 20 years. It's become a pillar of global high technology, and yet this has not really affected the way that the Israeli governments of recent years have viewed the whole issue of the settlements. Organized religion is another force that could weaken settler colonial regimes, as in South Africa, where in 1982 the World Alliance of Reformed Churches suspended the South African Dutch Reformed Church because of its support for apartheid. No support on such a scale has come, nor is it ever likely to come, from Jewish religious bodies in the diaspora. Jewish solidarity, which is ethnic as well as religious, would not allow for such a rupture to occur. If it did, the instigators of such a split would most likely come from world Jewry's liberal denominations, Reform, Reconstructionist, in this country, liberal Reform. These are not considered fully legitimate by the State of Israel's dominant rabbinic authority. They would be dismissed by many a national religious Jew as traitors, akin, say, to the Hellenizers in ancient Palestine in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. Far more than in South Africa or Algeria or North America, Israeli identity has been forged by memory and longing, tragedy and nostalgia. Imagine for a moment that a European Christian state had been established in Palestine in the mid-1900s. Such a state would clearly have been a settler colonial state, but it would not have been a project for national revival and salvation. A Christian Israel would not have been fueled by the Jewish people's collective memory of the land and its yearnings to return there. Its Christian population would have been spared the crucible of the Holocaust, in the face of which a Jewish state was seen by Jews the world over as a desperate necessity. A Christian Israel might have been less resilient, less determined to survive, and hence more likely to succumb to a native revolt or to surrender political hegemony peacefully, as happened in Algeria and South Africa. Jews, traumatized by millennia of persecution and a lack of sovereignty, created a state whose military was sacrosanct. Although Israel is a parliamentary democracy governed by civilians, its politics are dominated by security concerns, and the country's most successful politicians are often former generals or members of elite commando units. A Christian Israel, like apartheid-era South Africa, would have a powerful army. It would live in a state of constant military preparedness. But Israeli militarism is as much a product of Jewish history as it is of the troubled environment in which the country exists. Because the enormous, insoluble problem facing Israel is that no amount of military strength can retroactively prevent the Holocaust. All nations are liable to think of themselves as exceptional. Settler colonial cultures are especially inclined to narratives of exceptionality associated with memories of persecution that catalyzed immigration, the hardships of the pioneer experience, and conflict with indigenous peoples. Still, the exceptionality of Israel cannot be reduced merely to these factors. As Israelis know full well, their little state is the signature of attention from over half of humanity dwelling in Christendom and the Islamic world alike. Like an entertainer tailed constantly by paparazzi, Israelis feel harassed by constant global attention, yet also derive collective pride from it. What would Israeli society and culture be like if tomorrow the country were simply ignored by the international community and media? It would become something unrecognizable. Israel is indeed a state of exception. As Carl Schmitt famously wrote, sovereignty is defined by the ability to suspend the rule of law and govern by emergency decree. The sovereign is not beholden to any power, not even that of the law. Substantial areas under Israeli control have been under one form or another of military law since the state's creation. The state of Israel has no constitution. It has no fixed borders. Following Schmitt, Israel's geopolitical fuzziness is the ultimate testament to the country's strength. It is held together by the collective will of its Jewish citizens and the governing elite's access to their human capital, as well as the financial support of world Jewry. Exerting a power and influence far greater than its size, Israel is the exact opposite of the disempowered diaspora, the diaspora of Jewish ghost people, Spukvolk, as decried by the early Zionist thinker Leo Pinsker. But Israel is just as uncanny. It is feared for its power. And yet Israel is in fact not powerful enough to utterly marginalize its native population, as the major settler colonial states successfully did. This is the hidden side, by the way, the unmentioned side of strident critiques of Israel. The sense that Israel's reach exceeds its grasp, that it projects vast might but is in fact small and amenable to pressure. This contradiction between power and powerlessness also bedevils Israelis, and it lies at the base of their collective identity. It characterizes Israeli Jews, well-known penchant for both hubris and anxiety, and for a solidarity that manages to survive in the face of bitter factionalism. It is difficult to foster an artless, unmediated national identity in a global environment in which the country's very right to exist is frequently challenged. And indeed, this phrase, right to exist, is fascinating. It shows up here and there in the history of national movements in the 20th century, used in a positive way to justify their claims before the international community. And yet this term, right to exist, as it's used in reference to Israel has a right to exist, doesn't have a right to exist. There's even a debate at the Oxford Union, right? resolved by this House that Israel has a right to exist. This is very, very unusual, particularly its frequently negative valence. Only a minuscule and fanatical fringe denies the right of other settler colonial states, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, to exist. In the face of the worst excesses of apartheid, the international community called for the end of an apartheid regime. They never said South Africa has no right to exist. Along these lines, Israel's most radical critics sometimes call for the destruction of the Zionist regime, but this language effectively denies Israel a right to exist, as it does not recognize Jewish as well as Arab collective rights in Palestine or call for peaceful and mutually respectful relations between the two nations. Now, there are many other areas of difference as well as convergence between Israel and the other cases of settler colonialism I've looked at today. Just to mention one briefly, in the case of Israel, Arabs are on the one hand within the state are citizens of the country. The Palestinians who live in the West Bank are not. Those who live in the cities live in a kind of a realm of partial autonomy. It's extremely complicated. And the fact that, unlike, say, in South Africa, Arabs appeared to be an essential part of the labor force, but in fact, as we have seen in the territories, they really haven't been. That is, between 1967 and 1987, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were a very important component of the Israeli economy as construction workers and as a captive market consuming Israeli goods. And I mean, they were really very important, but mainly as a labor force. Well, with the intifadas came a severe reduction in the number of Palestinians working in the country, and their place was taken largely by guest workers, Filipinos for domestic labor, Thai agricultural workers, Romanian construction workers, and so forth. So there are certainly differences. The difference also goes back to the very beginning of the Zionist project. In the early 20th century, Arabs outnumbered Jews in Palestine by 10 to 1, about that, the difference between blacks and whites in South Africa in the early 1900s. But the radical Zionist youth of the second wave of settlement, the early 20th century, did not want to profit from the Arab's body or to be a master of any sort of slave. As an Israeli historian named Boaz Neumann has told us, their hearts overflowed with desire, overwhelming, primal, intoxicating. The Zionist youth desired that the land desire them. They were suffused with a heartfelt and artless sense of homecoming. European colonists elsewhere did not experience a personal psychic transformation. They conquered and loved the land, but they were not infatuated with it. They did not aspire to melt into its landscape. As for the Zionists, Arabs were not merely indolent or static in keeping with classic colonial stereotypes. Instead, they argued that the Arabs lacked a vital life force. They were too natural, organically linked with the soil to be its faithful husband. They were undifferentiated extensions of its flora and fauna. And this fiery desire that Neumann elucidates vividly reminds us that the Zionist project represents a blend between two great historic forces, settler colonialism, as I've talked about today, but also the revolutionary reshaping of humanity, I referred to on Sunday, a project undertaken throughout the 20th century Western world. The transformative torque of each was vast. It has taken the combination of the two to overcome the obstacles to the creation of the Jewish state, to put Israel on the map and keep it there. Israel, as it took form in 1948, was minuscule, but the amount of energy required to create this state was akin to the energy required to fuse hydrogen atoms into helium. Zionism was the only form of settlement colonialism that was an intellectual project, that was structured by an ideology. The motley Dutch, German, and Scottish settlers who comprised the Afrikaner republics did not arrive with a coherent national identity. National consciousness developed organically as a product of immigration and shared experience. Well into the 20th century, the Afrikaans language lived in the shadow of Dutch, only replacing its European parent in 1925 as an official language of state. The first Afrikaans novel was published only in 1913. The Afrikaans Bible appeared only 20 years later. In the Maghreb, the transformation of motley Mediterranean communities into French Algerians was quick, but unchoreographed. And the Pied Noir's dialect, although featured in colloquial speech and novels, was not a literary medium in and of itself. There's no real parallel in the annals of settlement colonialism to the creation of a modern Hebraic culture, which was far more than a pidgin-turned Creole, like Pied Noir French or Afrikaans. Hebrew had been a religious and literary language before it became a vernacular. Now, as I've already noted, Zionism was mediated through texts, most important the Hebrew Bible. Weighed down by their textual heritage, Zionists attempted to create a spontaneous Israeli nativeness, but the attempts were artful and scripted. So you're trying to artfully create something artless. It's a term, for example, in Israeli folk dance, there's a term used, choreographed spontaneity. Right? So you're trying to create, it's the classic notion of inventing a tradition, which is hardly unique to the Zionist project, but it's particularly strong in the case of Israel. Now, unlike the other cases I talked about today, Zionism then was a coherent nationalist ideology rooted in competing yet overlapping language-based nationalisms centered in Hebrew and Yiddish. Although Jewish immigrants to Palestine incorporated at times some degrees of this ideology, it was impossible to live in the Yishuv of the Mandate period, not to mention the State of Israel, without being profoundly shaped by a mechanical and top-down structured collective identity. And that's very different from colonial North America, French Algeria, South Africa. At the end of the day, I was trying very hard in doing the research to find this kind of bottom-up, grassroots. At the end of the day, this is a very good case of top-down history really mattering. Israeli nation building was as rapid as, say, the growth of the Pied Noir community in Algeria, but the former, the growth of Israel, was far more directed and purposeful, its linguistic base vastly richer, its culture more endearingly adhesive. In time, Israelis did develop their own organic self-consciousness, akin to that of any people that shares territory and experience, as well as a common enemy. In modern Palestine, then Israel, ideology was a powerful accelerant that quickened and deepened the process by which immigrants become natives, outlanders become indigenous, the process by which Jews became Israelis while remaining Jews. Thank you.